Hi, everybody. David Noor back with you for another episode of Curvebenders Live. I'm elated to be joined by a Thinkers50 Radar 2021 colleague, Dr. Mandeep Rai. Hello, Mandeep.
Hello. Good to see you, David.
Likewise. What a great conversation in our podcast this morning. For our audience, we're live on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, and I'd welcome you to jump in with your questions. Just type them in and we'll take those in the session. So Mandeep, let's start with, for those that may not know as much about you or haven't had a chance to listen to our podcast, can you briefly give us a glimpse into your professional background? How did you get here?
I love that you asked that question, how did I get here? Because obviously I want to start from dot or even my past lives, but that's not what you're interested in. You're interested in just the professional part. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Let me see. So I was picked up at a milk round. A milk round is like a recruitment round that happens at university. I was studying politics, economics, philosophy, and the lady that recruited me was recruiting for a program called Women in the City, i.e. they were showing certain women that they had identified that being in the city would be a level playing field for them as it is for men or boys in the boys club, such that you can kind of manage all aspects of your life whilst working in a very high-powered job. So on that basis, I joined JPMorgan, private banking, and that's where I started my career. And the lady that hired me, her name's Jo Ryan. We are still very, very good friends, and she's like a godparent to my children now. She, at the time when JPMorgan merged with Chase Manhattan, I went to Jo and I said, Jo, I think before we embroil ourselves into further commitments and contracts, I'd love to take a short sabbatical. And we decided on 3 months. And I never expected that within those 3 months, which I spent in Central America, would lead to a whole nother profession, essentially. And I told you a wild story in the podcast. I can share that with you if you'd like, or I could skip on and make this a very quick journey. You tell me.
Yeah, finish the rest, but then I do want to come back to that, that really interesting hammock story, because I think it's fascinating of how it created a chain reaction to other things. But finish the professional journey, and then we'll go back to the hammock story.
Okay, so professionally, it was a long story, which I'm making short and saying that I fell into journalism and went on to work for the BBC World Service, as in freelancing from there for them, corresponding from around the world, basically being a roving reporter. And with the World Service, if you can report from anywhere but home, that's good. So that gave me the freedom in my 20s to really start reporting from everywhere. And the first place I went to was India. I'm of Indian origin. Third generation British, but really Indian in the sense that I speak Punjabi, I speak Hindi, and I really wanted to know India intimately, know all aspects of it. And so my first year was spent reporting from there. And then I went on to report from all other parts of Asia, Central America, South America, Europe, and lo and behold, I've now traveled over 150 countries. In that pretext of reporting, and then it went on to also reporting for Reuters. The World Service is primarily radio, and then I was asked to work in television, and I used to cover the NASDAQ, so financial news for NASDAQ, and UN reported from the UN, so political news. So it was a combination always of politics and economics throughout my career. But the more I reported, the more I could see the developmental needs we have, which has always been an interest of mine, like international development. And I wanted to see what it took to be able to make some real impact in that space. And I was told repeatedly that a master's is what you needed to work for an organization such as the United Nations or the European Union. And that working for NGOs, I felt as though there was always a funding trap. And so I went on to get a master's from the London School of Economics in international development, and worked with the UN and with the EU. And for me, a quicker and bigger impact is made through journalism. This is for me personally. Then I was able to make through international development, where the timelines are longer, and it's a different game. So you can still work within international development, but I felt as though through journalism, I was making more of an impact in that chosen field. And then I had this opportunity to create. 9/11 happened, and I was reporting, and I was reporting in the UN in New York. And I remember having to cover many, many stories of people being misunderstood, people being attacked, people being persecuted. And we're seeing, right now, what we're seeing in Israel and Palestine is not too far from what 9/11 felt like. It felt as though there was an attack on people, and it didn't matter where you sat, you felt assaulted. And even actually as a Sikh, so I'm a Sikh, and men who were wearing turbans, which is the tradition in the Sikh faith, they were also being attacked and misunderstood. And I had the opportunity to work with the government of Abu Dhabi and set up the first media venture capital fund in the Middle East. And this was really, the aim was to change the geopolitics around Islam and the way Islam was being perceived at the time. And there was a real sense of something quite incredible being possible, because one could invest in those who were not only singing the Quran, but those who were writing incredible stories, those who were creating theme parks, those who were not just creating Bollywood or Hollywood, but something else, that we would create a media that would reflect a part of the world that often isn't so well represented in the media. So that seemed, in the Sikh faith, there is this very strong belief to stand up for those who are being either oppressed or persecuted, or the underdog, essentially. And it felt as though this was a good moment to do exactly that. So we set up an organization called 2454, which are the coordinates of Abu Dhabi. And I had the domain of Ibtikar, which is the fund. And so Tony Austin hired me as kind of the second and third, and then we grew and grew and grew. And it's a really thriving, incredible establishment today. And while I was there, I really felt as though I had a lot of incredible responsibility. And it felt as though an MBA would be helpful. People were trusting me a lot, and I just wanted to be even kind of, I guess, more qualified for that role. And so alongside working, I started an MBA with London Business School based in Dubai, and won a place at opportunity to study at Harvard Business School and MIT. And there I fell into the world of values with two professors, Sumatra Ghoshal, who had passed on and worked very closely with Nitin Noria. And so over the next 10 years, a whole world of values really was created. And I can go into more of the nuances of that. But essentially, that's how I got to today. It's a combination of finance and venture capital, international journalism, and development.
So you and I, thank you for that. Great background. And again, as we discussed it in the podcast, what an amazing journey that, interestingly enough, have woven together to create, I think in some ways, the fabric that's you. Let's talk about, I love that hammock story. So you decide to go to Cuba, and you want to be and feel more authentic and less kind of branded. So you put some of the things you own in a hammock and you give it to a complete stranger. Is that true?
Yeah. So we're talking about Fidel Castro's Cuba. So the idea was to, at that time, I knew Spanish well enough to kind of pass as, like, if you weren't listening too closely, I could pass as Cuban. If you weren't looking too closely, my complexion, my hair, everything can kind of just about pass. So the idea was that rather than being a tourist in Cuba, sitting in hotels and never really getting to interact with the local population, which is what it was. It was two systems, the dollar economy and the peso economy. And the two weren't meant to meet. And if the police caught you meeting, it could create trouble. So the thinking was that if you could walk out of the airport and literally you have no luggage on you, you're acting like a local, you have a little handbag and, you know, walking side by side. And at the time I knew a professor from the University of Havana. And so the idea was that I would walk in tow with him as if he's my university professor, and we just speak Spanish and walk through the streets. And before you know it, you know, literally before I knew it, the whole month unveiled into me staying with a friend of a friend, and then with his cousin, and then with an aunt, and then with the grandparents, and et cetera, and crisscrossing the island and really experiencing what local life was like. And that would not have been possible if I had Puma trainers on, or if I had a huge hammock that I had picked up from Mexico, or even if I had Colgate. Like, you know, if I had these huge bags and luggage, etc., then I would be a tourist. And so I had spent the night literally waiting in Cancun airport for like the first early morning flight to LA. It was like a 5 a.m. flight. And the people, when they started queuing up for the flight, there was this one woman who really stood out. She had flaming red hair and a green silk suit, and she was quite tall. And I didn't really notice that there was a pilot standing next to her. He wasn't the pilot of the aircraft. He was just a friend of hers, but he was a little bit shorter, and I just didn't notice him. And so I went up to her and just asked politely whether she could kindly allow me to put my bags into check-in when she checks in, and if she wouldn't mind to just not touch them when she gets to LA, you know, and let them go round and round the conveyor belt, and eventually they'd end up in lost property. That was the theory. And as soon as I asked her, the pilot next to her said, "Kathy, are you," and I'm going to do an atrocious American accent, "you must be joking. There's like marijuana, it could be cocaine, opium, who knows where this girl is from." And Kathy saw in me, I guess, the same, I don't know, wild like curiosity that her son had. His name was Dan Eldon, and he was a photojournalist. And when Kathy met me, I was 21, and Dan, who was the youngest photojournalist for Reuters, who I then went on to work for, had been stoned to death in Somalia. They were living in Kenya, and he was on an assignment. And when the embassy was bombed, the Somalians were angry, and they just attacked the three kind of white people who were taking photographs, essentially.
So Kathy calls you from LA and says, you know, talk about the email you got from Kathy.
Yeah, so she writes to me, and you know, she says she's writing from this is the one only piece of communication she's allowed from the prison cell, essentially, and that there were sniffer dogs all over my bags. She has no idea what was in them, but she wished she hadn't touched them. And I'm like sweating at this point. I'm like sitting at this computer screen with my few minutes of internet that I'm allowed in Cuba. And I scroll down, and she's writing. And as I get down, she's like, "Only joking, but if you want your bags back, you're going to have to come to my home and come and visit me properly. Then they're not in lost property." And when I eventually do get to LA and get to her home, I realize, like, there's, you know, Whoopi Goldberg in her living room, and that evening we meet with Mariah Carey, and she lives in this world of film and documentaries and books and journalism, and that's how my world changed, essentially, because she said, "What are you doing right now? Why don't you join me and create this PBS series that we're creating called Global Tribe, because you've been to the countries that we're covering anyway."
So let's talk about your book. You wrote The Values Compass, And Mandeep, you featured 102 countries and really unique values that most people may not necessarily associate with those countries if they haven't traveled or not familiar with them. Talk a little about how did you pick the countries? How did you pick the values? And let's start there.
So I love that you say it's 102. It's true. I market it as 101. The book's coming out as like the guide to the Olympics in Japanese. And rather than saying the values compass, the Japanese have written 101. So it's 101, but there's a bonus chapter. So you're right, there's 102, but that's meant to be a bonus. So I chose the 101 and eventually 102. Based on, well, firstly, they had to be places that I had been to, experienced, really had a first-hand interaction with and knowledge of. And then, so already that's not the entire world, eventually will be, but at this point it was 101. And the values emerged from a combination of what I was struck by, what I was hit by, so observation. And then you unravel that observation. Where does it come from? How is it stacked up? Is it true? And it's a series of interviewing people from like presidents and prime ministers to shoe cleaners, and everyone in between. It's a combination of looking at the history of the country, the geography. How is it that these values have been formed? Where in the world is this country positioned? Under what context? Under what regime? And you get a combination of like psychology and sociology and the psyche of the people. And over time, this was my personal experience that I was struck by, and I share that. And it's not to say that this is the only way, that this is the value of the country, or this is the only way that country can be defined. My simple aim was to take you on a colorful journey, but for you to really think about, wow, what does it feel like when respect, for example, is at the center of society, as it can often feel is the case in Japan? What does it feel like when there's this sense of gerong chai or consideration from Indonesia? Or how is a society functioning when it's got such an entrepreneurial drive, or is willing to pivot and pivot and pivot until it gets it right, such as the United States of America? Or when there's such commitment to a cause, or to a faith, or to even self-expression, as you see in Iran. And then I deliberately choose that for you, David. So, I take you, it's just a colorful journey for you to really think, which of these values resonate with me? Like, how would my life change if I were to put devotion at the forefront, or health, as is the case in Bulgaria? But actually, that value of health, we have seen really the whole world to adopt in the, during the pandemic over the last year and a half. We have all made health kind of our number one priority, to the point that it's changed our lives completely. So when
I was going to say, you didn't stop at the colorful journey. And I love this connection. You believe that a lot of these values, when aligned with the executive, the CEO, the leader of the organization, absolutely can transfer to universities and organizations. And you're passionate about this with the World Economic Forum. So talk about that bridge from the values you captured in these countries through your travels, through your work, to their applications in organizations.
So whilst I was at business school, we had found that it was between 2008 and 2010. That was my MBA period. And at the time, business was almost synonymous, or businessmen were synonymous with used car salesmen. We had Enron, we had people being taken into prison. We had a real lack of trust and ethics and code and conduct. And what we found is that actually people graduating at that time had a real sense of what they stood for, had a sense of their values, but that they weren't ever asked what they were, or they weren't ever asked to take a kind of a code of, or an oath, like you do in business or in so like you do in medicine or in law. And so we thought, well, why not? Just as you'd expect a lawyer to stand up with rigor in that profession and to stand up for the letter of the law, or you expect your doctor to really stand for the patient rather than, being involved in any corruption or anything else. Equally, we could have an oath within business. And so we started to take an oath, literally. We created an oath and we took an oath to say what we stood for. And this was for such that we were stood for all stakeholders in society, not just the shareholders. And as we took that from Harvard Business School to London Business School to other business schools, well, then why should it stop at business schools? Why not master's programs around the world? And then for this to really make an impact, it could take 20, 30, 40 years before those students are really in a position where they make the impact. So what about if we work with organizations now? And so we talked to the young global leaders at the World Economic Forum, and many of them took the oath. And then we started to work with organizations and can see that when that level of rigor and those values were brought into an organization, not just as a document that collects dust on the top shelf, but as their DNA, their raison d'etre, their reason for having been set up in the first place to serve a particular problem, solve a particular problem, or serve a particular market or society or community, that when they articulate what those values are, then the way that they resonate with those values, the way that they operate, the way that even who they choose as their supply chain, or the employees that self-select and join that firm, or the way that people are rewarded, everything starts to shape according to that value system. And it really transforms an organization. It transforms how.
Let me ask you on that point. So great point. Why do you believe, and you and I briefly talked about this in the podcast, that you and I are going to be hard pressed to find anyone who doesn't believe values are important? What I struggle with is, why do you believe we don't spend, and I appreciate Elizabeth jumping in with her comments, why do you believe we don't spend as much time exploring them further and becoming a lot more intentionally curious about what those values are, what they should be, and are we in fact living those values in our organizations? Talk about that for a minute.
The question is, why we know that values are important, but why is there a gap between them being important and us living by those values?
Yes.
I think because, well, the work that we're doing right now with organizations is such that if you're a startup and as you're forming, you are thinking about your value system, and that's how you're being built, and that's your foundation, then they're very much the DNA of your organization. If you're a huge multinational, and we've worked with very big multinationals such as PwC, who asked each and every one of its employees about their value system and surveyed and created a very kind of rigorous structure, like value structure within the organization, then again, it becomes the DNA of the organization. But there is a tendency within both individuals and organizations to just react and not necessarily take the time to, and it doesn't take long, this process really doesn't take long, but it's worth doing, to take the time and really identify and articulate those values. If you don't, you're just focused on the problem or the product that you're creating, and you're reactionary. So I think it's just simply a matter of putting in the why before the how and what and when and what and all the other kind of action points that we're doing. This is the reason for which we're doing it. And when you go through that process of identifying which, let's say, 5 values you have chosen and prioritized, then, as I said, then you find that the way employees come into the organization, they come in with like 110, 150% of themselves, rather than dragging in, 70%. And what we're finding, or even less, what we're finding also is that as people's way of interacting with their company changes yet again, and as we're emerging out of the pandemic, there are all kinds of shades of difficulties people have faced in this period. For some people, it might be that they have a sense of anxiety. For some people, it's this sense of not being able to sleep properly anymore. For some people, there's been a sense of having to juggle a whole host of responsibilities rather than having clear delineation in their workday. For some people, it might be, a kind of a mild form of depression even. There's a sense of everyone's been kind of piecemealing this time together and approaching now. Now, if you're coming back, when you're coming back, however you're coming back, whether it's a hybrid working model or a fully electric working model, the aim is to shake that off and to come back to the core, your foundation of why it is that you're doing what you're doing. And much more importantly, not even like, your kind of what brings you joy, what gives you motivation. It's like igniting your very best self again. And that's what, when you come from a place of your values, you're able to do.
And in our conversation, the podcast, you made a comment that you believe this pandemic has recalibrated those values, recalibrated that kind of purpose for many of us. So you believe, and you gave me some great examples of companies that not only have realized and have tightened their aperture on what those values are, but whether it's MasterCard or Microsoft or others that are now showing up in a big way. Talk about the impact of the pandemic on our values. And can you give us some examples of companies that are really amplifying what those values mean to them?
Yes. Well, we had spoken about how in this time, I think we had spoken about what makes a good leader, and how we were able to identify those leaders and the leaders that shone, and how in this period, being just competitive is not enough. Being able to collaborate is what's going to create the solutions for tomorrow. And we've seen that right from the get-go. Being able to be creative with technology, being able to be compassionate about what's happening within your team, being able to be aware and compassionate about the context that we're sitting in, the global context that we're sitting in. And so we spoke about some of the companies that have been able to do that. And we spoke about MasterCard, who immediately, not both during the pandemic and also just recently, as India has really been suffering and lacking even just simple oxygen concentrators. And we spoke about how Microsoft donated a lot of money just recently, actually, even J.K. Rowling, the author, donated 6 figures from her foundation for oxygen concentrators. It's this sense of whatever institution or organization, or even as an individual, the sense of being able to step up and not just see. I think what the pandemic has done is created a sense of empathy that wasn't necessarily there in the same way that it is now. A sense of that we're one, that we're unified, that something that's happening in my corner of the planet is actually going to affect you much faster than you could ever have thought would have been the case before. Not only have we seen this in the pandemic, but I think we also see this just as, because we don't know how these variants are going to change and the impact that they're going to have in different places at different times. We could be the next India and they could be the next us. It's like this interconnectivity, you are me, I am you, we are one. And so that level of compassion, empathy, collaboration, creativity, everything is what has created this pivot point, I believe.
So for our audience, if you've joined us late, you're listening to Dr. Mandeep Rai, author of the book Values Compass, and we're talking about values-based alignment. So Mandeep, Mark is jumping in with a great comment that, I think this pandemic has created, walking the talk for individuals and leaders and organizations. And he's got some great content there, but he talks about at the end, I'm very fortunate to work for a wonderful company that has really demonstrated its values. My question of you is, let's say that's not the scenario. Let's talk about I have a certain values that I deeply believe in. What's what's a constructive way for me to bring those more to bear and or guide my team, my organization to both recognize but also amplify some of those values without throwing up my hands and saying, you know what, they don't get it, I'm going to go, somewhere else. What's a good way for me to help my organization see more of these values?
So you initially, when you were speaking, I could vision you as maybe the owner of the organization or leading the organization. And then as you carried on speaking, I thought, is he an employee? Right. And so let's just take an example. Where within the firm?
Give us both. So obviously as an owner or a leader, it's just easier. I think it's easier to kind of bring those together. But if I'm an employee, how do I do that?
Right. So, okay. So let's take you as an owner or a leader. Depending on the size of your organization, depending on if you want to be truly collaborative and have it such that you want to throw out both your values and listen to everyone else's values and see where you land. But the chances are that if you have the conviction that I can hear in your voice and you already know your values, probably the people that you're recruiting and the way that they're operating and the reason that they're in the firm is because they're attracted to those values too. What we're finding is that millennials, the younger generations, are much more value driven than I think older generations have been or had allowed themselves to admit themselves to be. Because for some younger people are able to they're wanting to make the sacrifice. If it means that they earn less but get to do something that they really truly believe in, they're willing to do that. If it means that they pay 50% more for a product or service, that it has the supply chain that they agree with, is fair trade or is organic or has the ethics that they believe in, then they're willing to pay more. And so what we're finding is that already, if you're a leader of an organization, your values will be intertwined. If you want to become really clear about that and really make it transparent and have it communicated to everyone, etc., then it's which kind of process do we want to take? Do we want to have it so that we work with all your employees? Do we want to work with the C-suite and then communicate it down? And we decide what's right for your organization. So it's not that there's one size fits all. There's definitely a process that will be bespoke and right for your organization, depending on how people have been recruited and where they're at. If you're an employee, by no means am I saying that you need to leave or you need to stay or anything of that sort, because actually you will find that there are very valid reasons for which you made the decisions that you've made so far. But the pandemic has allowed a reset moment. It has allowed us to think, why am I in the life I'm in? Where else could I do what I'm doing? People are moving. How else could I do what I'm doing? People are finding other ways to work. Should I be even doing what I'm doing? Or is there another space within this organization? Or should I be creating my own organization? There are lots of questions people are asking themselves, inching closer and closer to their value system. Because when you do derive, as the Dalai Lama says about the book, more harmony, fulfillment, happiness. Because moment by moment, as we're making our decisions, in the drumbeat of life, minutes and minute, but indeed also the very big questions we're asking ourselves and big decisions we're asking ourselves, these are all based upon our values. But we don't ever see it like that. It's not as though, we're not necessarily aware of it, but that is what's taking place. And what we're simply doing is saying, why don't we allow ourselves 15, 20 minutes, half an hour to become really aware of what it is that's driving us, actively choose those values. Be sure, are they the values that we wish to be driving us, or is it something else? And once you've actively chosen them and prioritized them, then you feel as though you're being led by something that you've already bought into, you already agree with, and then the drumbeat of life and all the decisions are easier to make.
So one of my suppositions is, as this post-pandemic business renaissance kind of takes off, as we get more vaccinated, as we begin to travel more, and as companies begin to regain their foothold, let's say in travel or hospitality or some of these industries that have been really impacted by this pandemic, Mandeep, I believe there'll be a big shift in the labor pool, right? So you've got what I call the great resignation, where a lot of, those that may have been on the fence and weren't taking calls from recruiters are now suddenly open to new opportunities. You've got in many industries what I call the silver tsunami, where the seasoned generation is kind of retiring and looking at alternative work models. And we're trying to desperately bring the next generation into some of these fields. Do you believe, or what role do you believe values, both, again, recognizing them, but also amplifying them in not just your corporate communications and website and all that, but just how you show up as a company comes into the ability of the organization to attract and retain exceptional talent?
It is fundamental to that process. The values you choose, the values you communicate, the values you operationalize will 100% determine the type of people you then recruit and the type of people you are able to retain and the type of people that you would naturally then start to reward. So the entire chain, human resource chain, is actually based on like the value system that the organization chooses. When we find that when we're choosing people to work with us, we talk about wanting diversity, but that doesn't mean just someone who's of a different skin color, or someone who's of a different gender, or someone who has different abilities, or someone who has, has a different kind of background. It's also just diversity in thought. And that diversity in thought, and that's why I think the Values Compass has been shortlisted as kind of the Business Book of the Year in the diversity, inclusion, and equality category, because we're looking at diversity, both global diversity, but much more importantly, diversity in terms of people who are able to bring different perspectives, just think in different ways. And you can have that sense of diversity even whilst having chosen a core set of values. So even if you choose, let's say, excellence as one of your values, or teamwork, the way you then practice that, if it's important to me, but I have a completely different way of practicing it or different way of bringing it to the forefront, you will find that the way we do business together amplifies, because we both believe in teamwork, but we have these slightly different interpretations of, or we have a slightly different way of doing business, or we have a slightly different way of attracting others who also believe in teamwork, etc. Or we have different ways of being a team. That in itself creates, and indeed, if you use that with excellence, and all those myriad or different ways of being excellent will just amplify that value further.
Mm. So we've got a great comment from Chris, refreshing conversation exchange. Chris, thank you. Where can I purchase Values Compass? Mandeep, I'm assuming Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all those places we buy books, this is available?
Indeed, all those places that we buy books, it's available. It's come out in different parts of the world in different languages. And yes, if for any reason you can't get a copy, please feel free to reach me on any social media platform, including LinkedIn, because there's no way you should be without. It should be very readily available.
One of the questions I asked of you in our podcast, and for our audience, norgroup.com/podcast, you'll find the latest episode of Mandeep and I had a great conversation earlier today. One of the questions I asked was, from your JPMorgan background, from setting up a media VC in Abu Dhabi, connect values to results, connect values to that P&L. Mandeep, it's no surprise that increasingly boards are asking the leadership team to drive, right, this post-pandemic growth, drive acquisitions, drive merger opportunities, drive enterprise value creation. And there's some that still believe the values are important, but that's that soft thing that we should certainly spend time and effort on. But you know what? I've got this hard set of metrics I need to go accomplish and achieve this quarter because I've got a analyst call coming up. So connect values to that mindset, to that set of, again, P&L responsibility, accountability for the performance, execution, results.
So it's not just been one VC fund or one investment bank. I've worked in several different funds and have exposure now as a board member into exactly what you're talking about. And I can categorically say that when, for example, we see a company such as Levi Strauss and it talks about originality, or when we look at a company which talks about sustainability, such as Unilever, and Unilever then acquires, for example, Seventh Generation with sustainability in mind, or when we look at a company that has innovation at its core, then you are not just, it's like a venture capitalist or an investor isn't investing in just the startup. They're investing in the founder and the values of that founder, because values unite, beliefs divide. So the idea that you have values that are much bigger and broader and better than that individual. So if I'm thinking, if innovation as a company is my value, originality is my value, then you know that they're going to constantly be striving, constantly be thinking, what's next? How else can I improve? What else can I do? You are investing in the bottom line right there and then. You're investing in something that you know will always be improving because of the foundation that they're sat on. It's the same as diversity. It's not that ROI is going to be impacted or less because there's diversity. In fact, we have shown time and time again that it increases, that your return on investment gets better and better. We can show that in funds that that we can do good as well as make money. And that's the same when you're coming from a place of values. People are turned on by the opportunity to come from a place of integrity or justice, or really stand for something much bigger than themselves.
Would it be fair to call them your organizational guardrails? That, these are the bookends, these are the guardrails in which we choose to operate. And if they're not within these, we're not authentic, we're not being real to ourselves and the things that we deeply believe in. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say they're almost yes, and almost I'd go and put it up on two levels. It's framework, your infrastructure. If there weren't any rules in place, it becomes really difficult to operationalize. And these are your rules. These are your reason for being, for setting up, for standing up, for being better and bigger every single day. Even if you're just 1% bigger and better every day, you see that difference. And when there's this framework in place, then both how others operationalize within that framework and how you operate is able to grow and nourish and nurture, rather than it being chaotic. And you know how it is, if you're only driven by one goal, it can become very easily soul destroying too. So if you're only driven, or the P&L is the only thing that you're focused on, then it's hard to ever feel a sense of satisfaction, when actually the truth is that balance brings us a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. And I think if anything, during this pandemic, that's what we've learned, that there are different aspects of life. There are several balls that we need to juggle, bounce, and make sure they don't fall and break or suffer, not just one or two, because we've seen that it's like looking after your physical health as well as your mental health, as well as your emotional health. And that's why actually I encourage a spread of values, 5 different values for that balance. One or two of anything in it without moderation, we know can be destructive.
You brought up several times operationalizing. So it's one thing to create that framework. It is often a big uphill battle to operationalize it. Talk about the top 2 or 3 operational challenges you've seen organizations run into when they try to bring those values to life.
That's a great question. One I was just hinting on in the last answer. That's that when we have too few, too narrow a focus, there's a dark or a shadow side of everything, including of values. Even if it's something as noble as love or service or compassion, anything to the extreme, if all you have is your focus on one or two, can actually tip over the edge and be destructive. And so one of the things to watch, or one of the pitfalls, is not to be too extreme, to have that sense of balance. The second one would be to prioritize, because if we think that all values are equally important, again, we're creating a conundrum for ourselves. It's a dilemma in each and every decision, because you've said these things are important, but they're equally important, and it doesn't work. You have to prioritize and put something as important for now as a number one for this particular period of time. And then once that objective or goal has been met, shuffle the cards again, and then you bring number two as number one, and then you find that your goals or your operationalizing is easier and actually happens, as opposed to these dead ends that we've just discussed and can take place.
In your travels, have you found a geography, could be a country, it could be a region, that tends to prioritize their values ahead of results, or lead with their values more than other regions geographically?
So meeting your results could also be a value, right? Competitiveness can also be a value. So I don't want to say that anything is more value-based or less value-based, but I would bring up Bhutan as an example of a country that's really thought the global system of chasing after GDP, or thinking that is, the gross domestic product is the most important metric or way of measuring ourselves, they've questioned and have put gross national happiness as their primary objective. And so imagine when you're an institution or an organization, or indeed in this case a country, where your objective is global happiness. So then you can see why in Thimphu, in their capital, why actually they have managed to maintain such a lack of urbanization, such that they've encouraged people, they've made the countryside or villages, try to make them as attractive as they can, have infrastructure, have schools, have medical centers, have facilities, such that in Thimphu there's only one set of traffic lights. And I think even that set of traffic lights they don't actually need. There's not that much traffic. They encourage meditation, such that often many families send their firstborn son to meditate for global happiness, for example. Or there are levels in which the King of Bhutan has thought about. He actually gave me a book called The Spirit of Happiness. They have actively thought about, what can we, instead of chasing money, if happiness was our objective, what would we be doing right now? Would we be investing in education? Would we be investing in health? How would we make sure that, being in service of others or thinking of others actually would create a greater sense of well-being and happiness than the sole pursuit or single pursuit of wealth generation?
This segment of the Curvebenders podcast is brought to you by the Bhutan travel industry, because after that description, I want to get on a plane and go. So I'm now really curious about gender differences. Have you noticed male and female leaders think differently about leading with these values as core to themselves and the organizations they lead?
So we have seen of late, for example, during this pandemic, we've seen many people laud the female leaders, such as the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And we've seen that female leaders perhaps have been more careful potentially. I always think it's very dangerous to say that men have certain values and women have certain values, or that there's even a difference in their leadership style, because of course there are always exceptions. But we have seen that I think some of those the more kind of nurturing aspects have come about and shown that, for example, being able to, or not being able to just communicate, but actually being able to listen is perhaps even more important than being able to communicate. And being able to really give people time, when in this period we've been back to back with meetings and not had the space and time to interact at the water cooler, or take a taxi with the intern, or have a chance to connect. And I'm speaking of CEOs and leaders, because that's you were talking about different genders and how they lead. Just the different setup has meant that we have to be a little bit more deliberate about now how we create that space and time to, and indeed how we go back into our organizations or create a hybrid model, such that those parts that have been serving us during the pandemic are in place, and those that weren't serving us before are eradicated. So I think it just takes an awareness from both genders right now. We have this, it's almost like a canvas, a blank canvas, to be able to really recreate. And this is an opportunity I think we cannot and should not miss.
One of the conversations you and I had, or topics we discussed, was I learned as much about, if not more, about my own books after they come out, because other people will read them and have their own examples, and they share or they push back on certain ideas that you shared. Have there been some ideas in the values compass that have either been refuted since you wrote it, or have been reinforced, and makes you think, like, I'm glad I had that foresight when I was writing it?
So as with everything, it would be both. What has really surprised me is how people have come back and shared how it transformed or changed their lives, how they had reflections or moments, aha moments, that I could not have ever envisaged or imagined. I don't know who's going to read the book. So when, for example, I was giving a talk at the University of Cambridge, and one of the professors who had asked me to do the talk asked me, because when he read the book, he began to realize how the sense of responsibility had actually driven his life throughout his life. And he'd always thought it's his drive for excellence, or that he's trying to prove himself, or that there's something else that's acting out. But actually it was needing and wanting to be responsible, and he could see where that had come from. Now that's a beautiful, there have been so many testimonials like that I've received, that I could never have imagined, never have dreamt up, never have penned like that. There are also moments where, for example, the value for France is protest, and every French person has protested about protest. It's come from their real sense of being able to strive for a better life, and if it means standing up, like equality, egalite, fraternity, like being able to stand up for what's right. And if that means they have to protest, then they'll protest. And if that means that they have to go to the nth degree, then they will do that. So it's actually a wonderful value. But initially, they would all protest to that value. And so it's really made me think about, I wouldn't say I had, obviously I didn't have a crystal ball, and never would I have dreamt that this pandemic would occur. However, looking back, it looks as if I had a crystal ball, because every nation has absolutely reacted in accordance to its values. China was completely pragmatic. Italy, real attention to detail. England was very steadfast in how it went about things. America, complete pivots when it had to. So it was just a very fortuitous way of the world kind of showing its colors, again, for us to then be able to highlight which of our colors do we want to put a spotlight onto. It's really, the book is giving you the opportunity to choose what's driving you, rather than you just reacting from your subconscious.
For our audience, if you joined us late, you've been listening to Dr. Mandeep Rai, author of The Values Compass, a Thinkers50 Radar 2021 colleague. Mandeep, thank you for being our guest. I shared your website. What's the best way for our audience to learn more about you and your work?
So you shared mandeep-rai.com. So you can find a lot from there. Thank you. And it would be you can find a lot there, but also a lot on every kind of social media platform. There are many ways of getting in touch with me. There's just a whole community. It's a whole movement, this values movement. So please do not hesitate in getting in touch.
Perfect. Thank you again for being our guest today.
You're very, very welcome. The last thing I'd like to say is we have an organization also called the V20, the Values 20, which aligns itself to the G20. And it's kind of like informing G20 policy with values. So you can see that values are working on the global level, the institutional level, and at a personal level. And so we are always operating in some kind of concentric circle of people. But if you start with yourself first, all the other pieces fall into place. So please don't hesitate in getting in touch.
Sounds great. Thank you again.
Thank you.